The moment he walked out the door, her world shattered. It was a crisp autumn evening when Daniel, a self-made millionaire with a reputation as cold as his bank account, left his pregnant fiancée, Clara, without so much as a backward glance. She stood in the doorway of their once shared home, her hands trembling over her swollen belly, watching his sleek black car disappear into the distance. He had promised her the world, a life of luxury, love, and security. But now, as the taillights faded, all she had was a broken heart and a future filled with uncertainty. Clara was no stranger to hardship. She had grown up in a modest household, where love was abundant but money was scarce. Meeting Daniel had felt like a dream come true, a whirlwind romance with a man who seemed to have it all. But as his wealth grew, so did his ego, and the man she fell in love with became a stranger. When she told him she was pregnant, his face had darkened, and his words cut deeper than any knife. "I'm not ready for this. You're on your own." For years, Clara raised their twins, Emily and Jack, alone. She worked tirelessly, sacrificing her own dreams to give them a life filled with love and stability. Meanwhile, Daniel's fortune soared. He became a household name, a symbol of success and power. But Clara never forgot the pain he caused, and as the years passed, a quiet resolve grew within her. She vowed that one day, he would feel the weight of his choices. What Daniel didn't know was that Clara's revenge would be as calculated as it was devastating. It wouldn't come in the form of anger or violence, but in a way that would strike at the very heart of his empire, and his legacy. Years later, as Daniel sat in his penthouse overlooking the city, he received a letter that would change everything. It was from Clara, and it contained a single sentence: "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn to lose." Little did he know, the revenge she had planned would not only destroy his wealth but also force him to confront the family he had abandoned, and the children who had grown up without a father. The days after Daniel left were a blur for Clara. She wandered through the empty rooms of their home, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. How could he leave her like this? How could he abandon his own children before they were even born? The weight of his betrayal pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But as the shock began to fade, a fierce determination took its place. She would survive this. She had to, for the sake of her babies. Clara's pregnancy was far from easy. The stress of Daniel's departure took a toll on her body, and she spent countless nights awake, her hands resting on her belly as she whispered promises to her unborn children. "I'll never leave you," she would say, her voice trembling with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Money was tight. Daniel had left her with nothing but the house, and even that felt like a hollow victory. She sold what she could, jewelry, furniture, anything of value, to make ends meet. But it wasn't enough. She took on odd jobs, working long hours despite her growing fatigue. Her hands grew calloused, her face lined with exhaustion, but she never complained. Every sacrifice was worth it if it meant giving her children a better life. The twins, Emily and Jack, were born on a stormy night in early spring. Clara held them in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she marveled at their tiny fingers and perfect features. In that moment, she felt a love so profound it eclipsed the pain Daniel had caused. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality of her situation set in. Raising 2 children alone was harder than she had ever imagined. There were nights when Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall as the twins cried in their crib. She felt so alone, so utterly defeated. But then she would remember Daniel's cold words, his dismissive tone, and a fire would ignite within her. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him destroy her. As the years passed, Clara's resilience became her greatest strength. She worked tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs while still finding time to be there for Emily and Jack. She read them bedtime stories, helped them with their homework, and cheered them on at school events. But no matter how much love she poured into them, there was always a shadow lingering in the background, a shadow shaped like Daniel. The twins grew up knowing very little about their father. Clara never spoke ill of him, but she didn't sugarcoat the truth either. "Your father chose to leave," she would say when they asked about him. "But that doesn't mean you're not loved. You have me, and I will always be here for you." Meanwhile, Daniel's life couldn't have been more different. He had built an empire, his name synonymous with success and power. He traveled the world, rubbing shoulders with celebrities and politicians, his every whim catered to. But there was a hollowness to his life. A void he couldn't quite fill. He told himself he was happy, that he had everything he ever wanted. But deep down, he knew the truth. One evening, as Daniel sat in his penthouse, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, he found himself staring at a photograph of Clara. It was an old picture, taken during the early days of their relationship. She was smiling, her eyes filled with warmth and hope. He hadn't thought about her in years, but now, as he looked at the photo, a pang of guilt shot through him. He shook his head, pushing the feeling aside. He had made his choice, and he had no regrets. Or so he told himself. But Clara hadn't forgotten. She had spent years planning her revenge, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, as she watched her children grow into strong, kind-hearted individuals, she knew the time had come. Daniel had taken everything from her. Now it was his turn to lose. Daniel's life was a whirlwind of opulence and excess. His name was plastered across billboards, his face graced the covers of business magazines, and his empire spanned industries, real estate, tech, and even entertainment. He had everything money could buy, a penthouse in the city, a private jet, and a collection of luxury cars that gleamed like trophies. But beneath the surface of his glittering success, there was a void he couldn't ignore. He told himself he was happy. He had freedom, power, and the admiration of countless people. Women flocked to him, drawn by his wealth and charisma, but none of them could fill the emptiness inside him. He moved from one relationship to the next, each one more superficial than the last. He threw lavish parties, attended high-profile events, and surrounded himself with people who praised him endlessly. Yet, no matter how much he achieved, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Daniel rarely thought about Clara or the children he had left behind. When he did, it was only in passing, a fleeting memory that he quickly pushed aside. He had convinced himself that he had made the right choice. He wasn't cut out for fatherhood, and Clara was better off without him. Or so he told himself. But the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. One evening, as Daniel sat in his penthouse, scrolling through his social media feed, a notification popped up. It was a message from an old acquaintance, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The message was brief but cryptic: "You might want to see this." Attached was a link to a news article. Curious, Daniel clicked on the link. The headline made his blood run cold: "Local woman wins landmark case against billionaire ex." His heart pounded as he read the article. It was about Clara. According to the article, Clara had filed a lawsuit against him, claiming he had failed to provide financial support for their children. The case had been quietly making its way through the courts for years, and now, a judge had ruled in her favor. Daniel was ordered to pay millions in back child support, and the media was having a field day with the story. His hands trembled as he set his phone down. How had this happened? How had Clara managed to keep this hidden from him for so long? Anger surged through him, but it was quickly replaced by something else: fear. This wasn't just about money. This was about his reputation, his legacy. He immediately called his lawyer, demanding answers. "How could you let this happen?" he shouted. "This is a disaster." His lawyer's voice was calm but firm. "Daniel, you need to understand something. This isn't just about child support. Clara has been planning this for years. She's not just after your money, she's after your name. Daniel's mind raced. He had always seen Clara as quiet and unassuming, someone who would never fight back. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She was stronger, smarter, and more determined than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, the fallout from the lawsuit grew. News outlets picked up the story, and Daniel's carefully crafted image began to crumble. People who had once admired him now questioned his character. Business partners grew wary, and deals he had been working on for months fell through. Daniel tried to fight back, using his wealth and influence to silence the media and discredit Clara. But for every move he made, Clara had a countermove. She had anticipated his every action, and her plan was unfolding with precision. One night, as Daniel sat alone in his penthouse, he received another message. This time, it was from Clara herself. The message was short but chilling: "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn to lose." Daniel stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had always been in control, always been the one calling the shots. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Clara's revenge had only just begun. Clara's plan was years in the making, a carefully orchestrated symphony of patience and precision. She had spent countless nights poring over legal documents, financial records, and news articles, piecing together the perfect strategy. Her goal wasn't just to hurt Daniel financially, it was to dismantle the life he had built, brick by brick, until he had nothing left but the truth he had spent so long running from. The first step had been the lawsuit. Clara knew Daniel would try to fight it, using his wealth and influence to bury the case. But she had anticipated his every move. She had gathered evidence meticulously: bank statements, emails, and even testimonies from people who had witnessed his neglect. When the judge ruled in her favor, it wasn't just a victory for her, it was a public humiliation for Daniel. But Clara wasn't done. Not even close. Her next move was subtler, yet far more devastating. She reached out to a journalist, a woman named Margaret, who had a reputation for exposing the truth about powerful men. Clara shared her story, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a calculated strike. She wanted the world to see Daniel for who he really was, a man who had abandoned his family to chase wealth and fame. The article was published on a quiet Sunday morning, but its impact was anything but quiet. By midday, it had gone viral. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire abandons pregnant fiancée, the untold story." Social media exploded with outrage, and Daniel's name was dragged through the mud. Daniel tried to contain the damage, issuing a statement through his PR team. He claimed the article was full of lies, that Clara was just trying to extort money from him. But his words rang hollow. People had seen the evidence, and they weren't buying his excuses. Meanwhile, Clara watched from the sidelines, her heart pounding with a mix of satisfaction and fear. She had known this would hurt Daniel, but she hadn't anticipated how it would feel to see her story splashed across the internet. It was raw, exposing wounds she had spent years trying to heal. But she reminded herself why she was doing this, not just for herself, but for Emily and Jack. They deserved to know the truth about their father, and Daniel deserved to face the consequences of his actions. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the article grew. Daniel's business partners began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with a man whose reputation was in tatters. Investors pulled out of his projects, and his stock prices plummeted. The empire he had spent decades building was crumbling before his eyes. But Clara wasn't finished. She had one final move, one that would strike at the very heart of Daniel's legacy. She reached out to Emily and Jack, who were now teenagers. They had grown up knowing very little about their father, but Clara had always been honest with them. She told them about the lawsuit and the article, explaining why she had done what she did. At first, they were angry, not at Clara, but at Daniel. How could he have abandoned them? How could he have lived his life as if they didn't exist? But as they processed their emotions, they began to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about holding Daniel accountable for his choices. Together, Clara and the twins decided to confront Daniel. They didn't want his money or his apologies. They wanted him to see the family he had left behind, to understand the pain he had caused. Clara sent Daniel a message, inviting him to meet her at a quiet cafe in the city. She didn't tell him Emily and Jack would be there. She wanted it to be a surprise. Daniel hesitated before agreeing. He knew meeting Clara was a risk, but he was desperate. His empire was falling apart, and he needed to find a way to stop the bleeding. Maybe, just maybe, he could reason with her. The day of the meeting arrived, and Daniel walked into the cafe with a mix of apprehension and arrogance. He spotted Clara immediately, sitting at a corner table with two teenagers. His heart skipped a beat as he realized who they were. Emily and Jack. For the first time in years, Daniel was face to face with the children he had abandoned. They looked so much like him, yet there was a hardness in their eyes that made him uneasy. Clara stood as he approached, her expression calm but resolute. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "Meet your children." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had spent years running from his past, but now it was staring him in the face, and there was no escape. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups created a deceptive sense of calm. But for Daniel, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on Emily and Jack, the children he had never known. Emily was the first to speak. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with a mixture of anger and curiosity. "So, you're our father," she said, her tone cutting through the tension like a knife. Daniel swallowed hard, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. He had faced boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations, but nothing had prepared him for this. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes narrowed. "You didn't know?" she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You left me when I was pregnant, Daniel. You walked away and never looked back. Don't pretend you didn't know what you were doing." Jack, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his expression a mirror of his sister's. "Why did you leave us?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Did we mean nothing to you?" Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years burying his guilt, convincing himself that he had made the right choice. But now, faced with the two lives he had abandoned, he couldn't escape the truth. He had been selfish. He had been cruel. And there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I was young and stupid, and I thought I wasn't ready to be a father. But that's no excuse. I should have been there for you. I should have been there for all of you." Clara crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "It's too late for apologies, Daniel. This isn't about forgiveness. This is about accountability. You need to face the consequences of what you've done." Daniel's heart sank. He had hoped that meeting Clara and the twins might give him a chance to make amends, to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. But now, he realized how naive that hope had been. Clara wasn't interested in reconciliation. She wanted him to suffer, just as she had suffered. The meeting ended abruptly, with Emily and Jack walking out of the cafe without another word. Clara lingered for a moment, her eyes locking with Daniel's. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn to lose." As Daniel watched her leave, a sense of dread settled over him. He had always been in control, always been the one calling the shots. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and despair. The fallout from the lawsuit and the article continued to grow, and Daniel's empire began to crumble. Investors pulled out of his projects, his business partners distanced themselves, and his stock prices plummeted. The media hounded him relentlessly, painting him as the villain in a story that had captured the public's imagination. But the worst part was the guilt. No matter how hard he tried, Daniel couldn't shake the image of Emily and Jack's faces. They were a living reminder of the life he had thrown away, the family he had destroyed. One night, as Daniel sat alone in his penthouse, he received a package. It was a small, unassuming box, but the sight of it filled him with dread. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling, and found a single item inside, a photograph. It was a picture of Clara, Emily, and Jack, taken on the twins' first day of school. They were smiling, their faces filled with joy and hope. On the back of the photo, Clara had written a single sentence, "This is what you lost." Daniel stared at the photo, his vision blurring with tears. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his choices. He had spent his life chasing wealth and success, but in the end, it meant nothing. He had lost the one thing that truly mattered, his family. As the reality of his situation sank in, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to make things right. He would step away from his empire, away from the life he had built on lies and selfishness. He would face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful they might be. But Clara's revenge wasn't finished. She had one final move, one that would ensure Daniel's downfall was complete. Daniel's decision to step away from his empire was met with shock and disbelief. The business world had always seen him as untouchable, a man who thrived in the face of adversity. But now, as he announced his resignation and began dismantling his holdings, it became clear that something had fundamentally changed. The media speculated endlessly about his sudden downfall. Some claimed it was the pressure of the lawsuit and the public backlash. Others suggested he had simply grown tired of the rat race. But no one could have guessed the real reason, the truth that Clara had been waiting to reveal. A week after Daniel's resignation, a press conference was called. The announcement came from Clara herself, and the invitation was simple: the truth about Daniel Carter will finally be revealed. The event was held in a small conference hall, but it might as well have been a stadium given the number of reporters and cameras packed into the room. Clara stood at the podium, her expression calm but resolute. Beside her were Emily and Jack, their faces a mixture of nervousness and determination. Daniel watched from the back of the room, his heart pounding. He had no idea what Clara was about to say, but he knew it would change everything. Clara began by recounting her story, the love she had shared with Daniel, the promises he had made, and the way he had abandoned her when she needed him most. Her voice was steady, but the pain in her words was palpable. "But this isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This is about my children. Emily and Jack have grown up without a father, and they deserve to know the truth about the man who left them behind." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "What you don't know is that Daniel didn't just abandon us. He hid a secret, one that could have changed everything." The room fell silent as Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents. She held them up for the cameras to see. "These are medical records," she explained. "Records that prove Daniel knew about a genetic condition that runs in his family, a condition that could have affected our children." Daniel's blood ran cold. He had buried that secret years ago, convinced it didn't matter. But now, as Clara revealed it to the world, he realized the gravity of his mistake. "Daniel knew there was a chance our children could inherit this condition," Clara continued, her voice rising with emotion. "But he chose not to tell me. He chose to walk away, leaving me to face the possibility alone. And when Emily and Jack were diagnosed with the same condition, he wasn't there to help us. He wasn't there to support them. He wasn't there to be their father." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, their cameras flashing as they focused on Clara and the twins. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "We've spent our lives dealing with this condition, wondering why our father wasn't there to help us. Now we know the truth. He didn't just abandon us, he lied to us. He hid something that could have changed everything." Jack nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "We don't want his money or his apologies. We just want him to know what he's done. We want him to understand the pain he's caused." Daniel felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had always told himself that leaving Clara and the twins was the right choice, that he wasn't cut out to be a father. But now, faced with the truth, he couldn't deny the depth of his betrayal. Clara's final words were directed at him. "Daniel, you thought you could run from your past. You thought you could build a life without consequences. But the truth always finds a way to surface. And now, you have to face it." The press conference ended with a flurry of questions, but Daniel didn't stay to hear them. He stumbled out of the room, his mind reeling. The empire he had built, the life he had crafted, it was all gone. And in its place was the truth, raw and unrelenting. As he walked through the empty streets, Daniel realized that Clara's revenge wasn't just about destroying his wealth or his reputation. It was about forcing him to confront the man he had become, a man who had chosen selfishness over love, success over family. And now, he had to live with the consequences. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily and Jack. They had grown up knowing their father was absent, but they had never fully understood the depth of his betrayal until now. The revelation about the genetic condition, and the fact that Daniel had known about it all along, had shaken them to their core. Emily, the more outspoken of the two, struggled with anger. She couldn't believe that Daniel had hidden something so important, something that had affected their lives in ways they were still coming to terms with. "How could he do that?" she asked Clara one evening, her voice trembling with frustration. "How could he just walk away and leave us to deal with this on our own?" Clara sighed, her heart aching for her daughter. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said gently. "Sometimes people make terrible choices, and they don't think about how those choices will affect others. But what matters now is how we move forward." Jack, on the other hand, was quieter, more introspective. He had always been the more sensitive of the two, and the news had hit him hard. He spent hours alone in his room, processing his emotions and trying to make sense of everything. One night, Clara found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a photograph of Daniel that had been included in one of the news articles. "Do you think he's sorry?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara sat down beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whether he's sorry or not, it doesn't change what he did. What matters is how we choose to live our lives, despite everything." Jack nodded, but his eyes were filled with tears. "I just wish things were different," he said quietly. "I wish he had been there for us." Clara's heart broke for her son. She had spent years trying to shield Emily and Jack from the pain of Daniel's abandonment, but now, she realized, they needed to confront it head-on. They needed to decide for themselves how they wanted to move forward. Meanwhile, Daniel was grappling with his own emotions. The press conference had been a turning point, forcing him to confront the truth about his actions and their consequences. He had spent his life running from his past, but now, there was nowhere left to hide. One evening, as he sat alone in his nearly empty penthouse, he received a message from Emily. It was brief and to the point: "We need to talk." Daniel's heart raced as he read the words. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew he couldn't refuse. He had caused so much pain, and now, he had to face the people he had hurt the most. The meeting took place at a park near Clara's home. It was a quiet, peaceful spot, far from the prying eyes of the media. Daniel arrived early, his nerves on edge as he waited for Emily and Jack to appear. When they finally arrived, Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. They looked so much like him, yet there was a hardness in their eyes that made him uneasy. Emily was the first to speak. "We're not here to forgive you," she said bluntly. "We're here to tell you how your choices have affected us." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I'm ready to listen." For the next hour, Emily and Jack took turns sharing their stories. They talked about the challenges they had faced growing up, the struggles they had endured because of their condition, and the pain of knowing their father had chosen to abandon them. Daniel listened in silence, his guilt growing with every word. He had always told himself that leaving was the right choice, that he wasn't cut out to be a father. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done, he couldn't deny the truth. He had been selfish. He had been cruel. And there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. When they finished, Daniel took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I've done, and for everything I've put you through." Emily and Jack exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Jack spoke. "Being sorry isn't enough," he said quietly. "But maybe it's a start." The meeting ended with a sense of closure, but also with the understanding that there was still a long road ahead. Daniel had a lot to make up for, and Emily and Jack had a lot to process. But for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for healing, if not forgiveness. As Daniel walked away from the park, he realized that Clara's revenge had achieved something he had never expected. It had forced him to confront the truth, to face the consequences of his actions, and to finally take responsibility for the pain he had caused. And in doing so, it had given him a chance to become a better man. The air was thick with tension as Daniel stood outside Clara's home, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He had spent weeks reflecting on the meeting with Emily and Jack, and now, he knew there was one final person he needed to face, Clara. He took a deep breath and rang the bell. Clara opened the door, her expression unreadable. She wasn't surprised to see him, in fact, she had been expecting this moment for years. "Daniel," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the kind of love and care that Daniel had never been able to provide. Photos of Emily and Jack lined the walls, capturing moments of joy and triumph that he had missed. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile life he had built for himself. Clara led him to the living room, where they sat across from each other in silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've spent so many years running from the truth, but now I can't escape it. I hurt you. I hurt our children. And I don't know how to make it right." Clara studied him, her gaze steady but not unkind. "You can't make it right, Daniel," she said quietly. "What's done is done. But you can choose to do better. You can choose to be better." Daniel nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I want to," he said. "I want to be the person you and the kids deserved all along. But I don't know if it's too late." Clara sighed, her expression softening. "It's never too late to try," she said. "But you have to understand something. This isn't just about you. It's about Emily and Jack. They've spent their lives wondering why you weren't there for them. If you want to make amends, you need to start with them." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him. "I know," he said. "And I will. I'll do whatever it takes to earn their trust, to show them that I'm serious about being a part of their lives." Clara nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "It won't be easy," she warned. "They've been hurt, and it's going to take time for them to heal. But if you're willing to put in the effort, then maybe there's a chance." The conversation continued late into the night, with Daniel and Clara discussing everything from the past to the future. For the first time in years, they were honest with each other, laying bare their regrets, their hopes, and their fears. As the hours passed, Daniel began to see Clara in a new light. She wasn't just the woman he had left behind, she was a strong, resilient person who had overcome incredible odds to build a life for herself and their children. And he realized just how much he had lost. When it was finally time for Daniel to leave, Clara walked him to the door. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. But it's up to you to decide what kind of beginning it will be." Daniel nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me a chance." Clara smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You've got a long road ahead of you." As Daniel walked away from Clara's home, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He had spent his life chasing success, but now, he realized that true success wasn't measured in wealth or power. It was measured in the relationships he built, the love he shared, and the legacy he left behind. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to start building that legacy. Months passed, and the world moved on. The media frenzy surrounding Daniel's downfall faded, replaced by new scandals and headlines. But for Daniel, the journey was just beginning. He had made a promise to Clara, Emily, and Jack, a promise to be better, to do better. And he intended to keep it. The first step was rebuilding his relationship with his children. It wasn't easy. Emily and Jack were understandably wary, their trust in him shattered. But Daniel was determined. He attended every school event, every doctor's appointment, and every milestone, no matter how small. He listened when they spoke, apologized when he made mistakes, and showed up, day after day, even when it was hard. Slowly, tentatively, they began to let him in. Emily, ever the pragmatist, was the first to give him a chance. "I'm not saying I forgive you," she told him one evening after a particularly tense conversation. "But I can see you're trying. And that counts for something." Jack, more reserved, took longer to come around. But one day, as they sat together watching a movie, he turned to Daniel and said, "I'm glad you're here." Those 4 words meant more to Daniel than any business deal or accolade ever had. Clara watched from the sidelines, her heart torn between hope and caution. She had spent years protecting her children from the pain of Daniel's abandonment, and now, she had to trust that he wouldn't hurt them again. It wasn't easy, but she could see the change in him, the way he prioritized their needs, the way he put their happiness above his own. One evening, as they sat together on her porch, Clara turned to Daniel and said, "You've come a long way." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I have," he said. "But I still have a long way to go." Clara smiled faintly. "We all do," she said. "But as long as you keep trying, that's what matters." As the years passed, Daniel's life took on a new rhythm. He stepped away from the cutthroat world of business, choosing instead to focus on his family and his own personal growth. He started a foundation to support families affected by the same genetic condition that Emily and Jack had inherited, using his wealth and influence to make a positive impact. It wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself, but it was a life filled with meaning, a life built on love, forgiveness, and second chances. One day, as he sat with Clara, Emily, and Jack at a family dinner, Daniel felt a sense of peace he had never known. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led him here, to a table filled with laughter, love, and the people who mattered most. As he looked around at his family, Daniel realized that Clara's revenge had been the best thing that ever happened to him. It had forced him to confront his past, to take responsibility for his actions, and to become the person he was always meant to be. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all.